So I have the great pleasure of introducing an individual who has devoted a lot of time and energy to looking back into the case of Christian Week and compiling a brief history of a medium that mattered. And this individual is the former professor of history at the University of Manitoba, a very capable individual and a friend of Christian media and Christian Week. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Gerry Bowler, future Reverend Bowler is what he tells me. So he's looking for an honorary reverendship. Dr. Bowler.
Thank you, Brian. In that sterling introduction, you omitted the part where, despite all my years of writing for Christian Week, the Canadian Church Press awards never had the name Gerry Bowler on them. There is no bitterness, just deep suspicion. Hi. Good morning, truth seekers. I ask you to step with me into the Wayback Machine and to join me and my ridiculously medieval tie. Go back to the 1980s. And in the very first issue of Christian Week magazine, the political scientist John Redekop observed that most conservative Christians in North America believed in the following: the work ethic, free enterprise, limited government, respect for authority, family values, no abortion, law and order, constraints on pornography, decency in public entertainment, a Judeo-Christian ethos, and traditional sexual mores. Now, in 2019, some 30-odd years later, anyone professing such attitudes in public would be labeled an enemy of the people, a creature of white privilege, heteronormative, cisgendered, and patriarchal, an opponent of diversity, and doubtless an oppressor of the poor. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. From our present viewpoint, at the end of the second decade of the 21st century, the world of 1985 might strike us as someplace alien, innocent, and exotic. Canadian children had no inkling of digital entertainment. They were brought up on The Friendly Giant, The Littlest Hobo, and Mr. Dress-Up. Not the current Prime Minister, but a respectable, middle-aged man with two sketchy puppets, Casey and Finnegan. Their parents watched Wayne and Schuster, The Beachcombers, or The Tommy Hunter Show. They openly smoked cigarettes in restaurants and on airplanes. And when the year began, there was no DNA analysis to solve crime, and one of those new portable cell phones weighed 10.5 pounds, had a 30-minute battery life, and cost $4,000. Roger Moore was still James Bond. Wayne Gretzky was still an Oiler, and the Soviet Union seemed a powerhouse. In 1985, Harold Jantz, mild-mannered editor of a Mennonite paper, left secure employment to build a new magazine, one that would link evangelical Christians across Canada to each other and which would explain conservative Christianity to the outside world. For the next 2 years, under the aegis of Fellowship for Print Witness, he would assemble a board of advisors, raise money, recruit writers, put together a Winnipeg-based production team. Joining Harold on the first masthead were his wife Neoma as bookkeeper receptionist, Ray Dirks as art director, production assistant Diane Zacharias, and the most important hire Jantz would ever make, Doug Coop, who had been snatched away from the blandishments of an international mission group to become assistant editor. In 1985, Canada was, to all appearances, still a Christian country. Sunday was a near universal day of rest. Most Canadians identified with a Christian denomination. Most children had some experience of Sunday school. To be sure, church leaders were aware of a drop in attendance that had been in evidence since the mid-1960s, but mainline denominations clung to the belief that their struggle to be socially relevant and accommodating would pay off in the long run. Conservative churches were less willing to bend to contemporary mores. They still held the line on skirt length, gender roles, and lottery tickets. And just as a dinosaur placidly grazing in a primordial swamp on that fateful day 66 million years ago might have regarded that plummeting asteroid as of little significance, Canadian Christianity was unprepared for the impact of the social change that was headed their way by 1985. Those changes had been gathering force since the Criminal Code amendments brought in by Pierre Trudeau in the 1960s, and accelerating with the adoption of the new Constitution and its Charter of Rights, which would replace elected legislatures with courts as the final arbiters of contesting social claims. The first issue of Christian Week would have one of those contests on the front page, the issue of Sunday shopping, but the most momentous would be the liberalization of access to abortion. Until 1969, abortion had been illegal in Canada, except to save the life of the mother. In that year, the Liberal government made abortions permissible if a panel of doctors deemed a woman's life or health were threatened. This set off a lengthy tussle for public opinion between those wishing free abortion on demand and those who wanted significant restrictions. As Henry Morgentaler continued to defy the law, his well-publicized court cases and jail time made the topic a very hot issue. July 1987, Christian Week fired its first salvo with a report on churches lobbying the Ontario government about its plans to bring about easier access to abortion. The Christian Reformed Church and the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada were flatly opposed, but Anglican Archbishop Ted Scott could not bring himself to agree, producing instead a word salad in which he opined that government would be wiser not to act on trying to provide equality of access for those who desire abortions, but on achieving equality of access within a comprehensive overall policy which seeks to develop greater personal and social responsibility as well as greater justice. In September, the magazine published a two-page spread entitled Guilt and Grace in Abortion, a passionate sermon by Dr. Victor Shepherd, a United Church minister. They followed this up with an article on a BC court ruling that seemed, for a time, to protect unborn children, and another on Manitoba MLA Joe Borowski, who had reached the Supreme Court with a challenge on the question of whether a fetus was a legal person. But before the Borowski case could be heard, the Supreme Court ruled in the Queen versus Morgentaler that existing laws on abortion were unconstitutional, a breach of the woman's right to security of the person, which is guaranteed under Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The pages of Christian Week were flooded with reactions to the ruling. Overwhelmingly, they opposed the decision. Harold Jantz, in a front-page editorial, called it Lament for a Nation. When Operation Rescue courted arrests with nonviolent resistance outside the doors of an abortion provider in Vancouver, Jantz wrote another editorial defending their actions, citing Dietrich Bonhoeffer's anti-Nazi activities and Ugandan Bishop Lewin's opposition to Idi Amin as precedents for Christians legitimately defying unjust authority. Deborah Feguth, then writing for Christian Info in British Columbia, reported from the lengthy criminal contempt trial for those arrested in the sit-in. The magazine also commissioned a lengthy legal examination of the Morgentaler decision, exploring its reasoning and examining ways forward. Now, while this was going on, the Mulroney government was trying to find a political solution that would satisfy both the court and the public. Its first attempt would have allowed easy access to early abortion, but which would have restricted it in late pregnancy. This was defeated by a coalition of pro-choicers and pro-life absolutists. The next bill, C-43, in the 1990 parliamentary sitting, would make abortion illegal where a woman's health was not at risk. This was defeated by the famous tie vote in the Senate. And to this day, abortion is now permitted throughout all 9 months of pregnancy in Canada. On the pages of Christian Week, John Redekop, the national affairs commentator, argued that a compromise bill, though still allowing some abortions, would save the lives of countless babies. For this, he was thoroughly castigated by pro-life advocates who called him to task for not discerning that the lesser of two evils was still an evil. And letters kept coming in for months on that. Another opportunity for Christian Week to defend traditional conservative values was not long in coming. In August 1987, an article in the magazine noted that Manitoba had become the third province to recognize gay rights in legislation, despite former NDP Premier Ed Schreier's assertion that homosexuality was an affliction, and presentations from the EFC, Baptists, Mennonites, Big Brothers. A Mennonite spokesman had proposed that every politician who voted for the bill should be tested for AIDS to see if they had a conflict of interest. But United Church representatives and the Manitoba Association of Rights and Liberties supported the legislation. MARL declared that David and Jonathan had been gay. With the United Church issuing a report calling for the ordination of gays and lesbians, despite pushback from many congregations that indicated they might split, and objections from the evangelically oriented Renewal Fellowship inside the United Church, Doug Coop felt it was time to write an article on growing importance of the issue for churches. And the fact that he had to explain the term homophobic shows how little real space the topic had generated in most Canadian Christian publications by the 1980s. Surveying the situation, a Jantz editorial stated that enshrining gay rights in law was almost inevitable, but that the homosexual lifestyle should not be unopposed. Community rights, he said, matter as much as individual rights, and if, as Christian communities, we believe that homosexual practice is wrong, we should be able to set standards within our communities to reflect it. Evangelicals must also be better organized and careful about presenting their side of the argument. Not all that was said before the Manitoba Legislative Committee, Bill 47, honored Christ, he said, or was helpful. And that is so typical of the Harold Jantz attitude to controversy. Christian Week occasionally had a few frothing at the mouth commentators, myself included, but the courtesy, the gentlemanliness of the editorial stance, Harold Jantz in particular, is quite remarkable through all those years. In the early 1990s, Christian Week became more invested in alerting its readers to the impending impact that homosexual issues would have on various churches, and particularly they followed the debate inside the United Church on gay ordination. I don't know if any of you remember it, but it caused enormous stir inside the church with many, many dissident congregations threatening to leave or actually doing so. The magazine published an article on an ex-gay United Church minister who'd been a dissenter on the committee, representing that sexual orientation not be a barrier to ministry. And later, Christian Week would publish a 2-page spread on New Direction for Life ministry, a ministry for ex-gays. There were two other issues that focused the attention of the magazine on gay rights in a religious context. The first was the decision in 2002 by Michael Ingham, the Bishop of New Westminster, to bless same-sex unions, a step which inflamed the global Anglican community and led to a number of congregations in his diocese leaving the denomination. Headlines like "Anglican crisis deepens, traditionalists do not rule out a permanent split." And over the following years, the paper followed the legal spats as to who owned the buildings of the dissenting congregations. Ingham's threat to people like J.I. Packer and other rebellious clergy, and the turmoil in the international Anglican community were all duly noted. But it was a struggle for gay marriage that generated even more discussion in the paper, where the editorial stand was clear and unwavering. Throughout the years, we have regularly reported on the conflicts within denominations, Anglicans and others, over this and similar issues, always giving our priority to those voices which, in our judgment, reflect a commitment to historic Christianity. On the matter of same-sex blessings, our editorial stance has consistently reflected our biblically informed belief that God honors sexual intimacy between a man and a woman in marriage and finds it troublesome in other relationships. Nonetheless, Christian Week was never afraid to publish voices that dissented from their official stance. A letter from a pro-Ingham archdeacon chastised the paper for the failure to acknowledge that the bishop was endeavoring to maintain a unity in diversity, providing room and compassion for those whose moral imaginations cannot extend to their gay and lesbian brothers and sisters. Since when is injustice the hallmark of Christian orthodoxy? Shame on you. Marion Mead Ward, who'd been a regular contributor to Christian Week, caused blood vessels to pop in the forehead of readers all across Canada when she said in her column she couldn't see what all the fuss was about. She admitted that some biblical passages might be adduced to condemn the practice, but concluded that when law and compassion collided, she was sure God would go with the latter. And in reply to a flood of angry letters to the editor, publisher David Visser stated, "Christian Week is not a publication for baby believers. To further mature our thinking, we need to consider viewpoints other than those we already hold." Now, Christian Week was on the losing side in those battles, as well as others over the years, including Sunday shopping, teen sexual abstinence, access to pornography, public prayer, euthanasia, and government support for Christian educational institutions. But there were times in which they were in the lead in public opinion. And one of the most important of these was the question of Aboriginal rights. Long before any Royal Commission or Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the magazine was calling for wrongs to be righted and a reckoning made for the history of broken promises, outright fraud toward Native people, and blatant misrepresentation. The magazine covered various land claim stories, the National Day of Prayer for Canadian Indians, Elijah Harper's Sacred Assembly, the residential school abuse cases, and the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada's work on reconciliation. They cheered the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People and the TRC and the Charter of Forgiveness. Despite its enthusiasm for interracial justice and healing, Christian Week was also willing to call out the bullying that some Native Christians were receiving at the hands of practitioners of Indigenous spirituality. It was open to the possibility of using traditional symbols in Christian liturgy, but they drew the line at religious universalism. When a spiritual guide in a 2009 Christian Week article about sacred storytelling suggested Native people do not necessarily need Christ to move forward and move on. They need to find themselves and find their own spiritual awakenings from where they live. Editor Doug Coop stated, "This is not a point of view we can accept. Although most people in Canada can no doubt live with it quite comfortably, according to our statement of faith, we believe there is one mediator between God and people, the man Jesus Christ, who by his death redeems mankind from the power of sin, death, and eternal punishment." Another way in which Christian Week was ahead of the curve was its interest in Islam. At a time when no one had heard of Osama bin Laden or before any Gulf War or mass atrocity, a 1989 article entitled "Human Rights and Christianity Suffer Under Islam" by an American academic discussed disturbing trends in East Africa, Malaysia, and in American prisons. This was soon followed by a very prescient look at the rise of militant Islam in the Soviet Union, predicting trouble not only for the communist leadership, but for neighboring Christian peoples such as the Armenians. When the first Iraqi war broke out, Christian Week commentators were suspicious of American intervention. It's all about the oil. But after 9/11 and the conflicts that followed, the magazine tried to balance a clear-eyed look at Muslim jihad with trying to find a peaceful way to dialogue with Islam. This included publishing a very helpful series on Muslim theology by Saeed Abdul Rahim, an educator from a British mosque. Now, it must be said that the editorial policy of Christian Week always tended toward the pacifist and the anti-militarist. Harold Jantz said in a piece looking, I think, at D-Day that he probably would have been a conscientious objector during World War II, but the magazine also published a number of forceful advocates of just war theory and military intervention. Now, that's sort of theme one in my talk today, Christian Week standing up, commenting on, opposing the surrounding culture. But the second part has to deal with fulfilling the second part of its prime directive, and that is connecting the various parts of the Christian world, the Canadian evangelical world, to each other. And much of this done every issue in helpful but unspectacular ways, such as covering denominational conventions and personnel changes, resulting in a plethora of photos of middle-aged men in suits and ties. There are many occurrences in the evangelical subculture that would not receive much coverage in the commercial press: marches for Jesus, distributing the Why book, the spread of Promise Keepers in Alpha, or the promotion of True Love Awaits. On the pages of Christian Week could be found mention of the innumerable events which indefatigable evangelicals would stage year after year. Antioch, 88. Nineveh, 92. Inspiration, 93. Essential, 94. World Shapers, 96. Contagious Evangelism, 2003. Contagious Joy, 2006. Stronger Together, 2011. Stand, Refresh. Irrepressible Hope, Share the Wonder, Rivers of Worship, and my favorite, the Why Everything Must Change Conference. Where else would organizations such as the Christian Heritage Party or the Christian Freedom Party or the Family Coalition Party find a sympathetic readership? Where else would groups like the Saskatchewan Association for Responsible Conduct or Citizen Impact see their aims reach a national audience? Views that challenge the standard narrative on Darwinian evolution, Messianic Judaism, climate change, end times prophecy, or the danger posed by human rights commissions could reach an evangelical audience thanks to Christian Week. In every issue, there were columns meant to help readers with their prayer life, family, business, computers, Bible knowledge, or aid in coming to grips with widowhood, the AIDS crisis, or contemporary culture. Book reviews focused on Canadian writers brought neglected talent to the fore, while special articles were commissioned on topics such as Christian camping, sexuality, gender, sports, and grief. Occasionally, a story that Christian Week had taken the lead on went, to use an anachronistic term, viral. One such was the Toronto Blessing, an outbreak of spiritual gifts at a Vineyard church, which the magazine first reported on in earlier 1994. I don't know how many of you remember it. It was quite something for all you young people, and I see a few of you young people in the audience. This was big. About 25 years ago, at a Vineyard church beside the Toronto airport, strange things started happening. People began to fall over, bark like dogs, become rigid. Holy laughter was particularly a manifestation, and my favorite later, the gold tooth phenomenon, in which dental implants were changed to gold. So this was not something that would have excited the Globe and Mail, but Christian Week got on it early, and this spread, the news of it spread around the world. Now, the magazine had always had an interest in the charismatic voice. They had interviews with John White, John Wimber, but this kind of topic really took off in '94 with what was called the Toronto Blessing. And from the first piece entitled Holy Laughter, Lifting Spirits, through many more, right through 2012, Christian Week kept tabs on the controversy, always drawing a spirited debate in its letters column. Another evangelical wrangle in which Christian Week had a leading role was the Theology of Mcmaster University professor Clark Pinnock. Pinnock had come to espouse two controversial positions: open theism, which argued that God's foreknowledge might be limited, and thus an argument for free will, and annihilationism, which held that damned souls were not tormented in the afterlife, but merely extinguished. Christian Week had published respectful views of two of Pinnock's books, as well as a number of letters and opinion pieces decrying his point of view. By the turn of the millennium, Pinnock was regarded by some as a heretic, and by others as an indispensable source of wisdom. There's one quote in Christian Week after a speech by Pinnock, I think, to some Pentecostals, saying, "This is not the voice of Pinnock, this is the voice of God." So clearly a guy that divided public opinion. So contentious were his views that the Evangelical Theological Society was moved to consider expelling him. And here's where Christian Week steps in. They had a splendid special edition that they had done earlier on Pinnock, and were able to distribute this to members of the society and thus contribute to the debate which eventually cleared Pinnock. Now, if Christian Week was intent on bringing the evangelicals in Canada closer together, they were also not afraid of challenging their subculture with articles that exposed the dark side of the realm. In a very early issue of the magazine, Harold Jantz asked, "Is evangelicalism ready to admit its weakness?" Castigating the faithful for individualism, spiritual hollowness, and insensitivity to sin. "The Christian voice will always be a minority voice," he said. "They need to be encouraged to witness lovingly, warn unceasingly, and serve unstintingly, whether they're in the minority or not." The magazine also coined the term it's a good word, but it's a tricky word. Evangelisticity. Evangelisticity. That's the tendency to exaggerate the numbers of people at a religious event. One of the first Christian Week stories to get international attention was Lorna Duick's expose of an alleged after-death experience that had been warmly embraced by American evangelicals in her 1991 award-winning piece, "Dream Turned Fact, Launched Best-Selling Author." That examined the case of Betty Maltz of Toad Hop, Indiana, who claimed that she had died on the operating table and reached the gates of heaven, which consisted, the gates were a solid sheet of pearl with no handles, some lovely scroll work, and Gothic touches. I believe that. I believe that part. It'll be none of your neoclassicism when you get to heaven. It's all Gothic. So she had been to heaven and returned. Maltz's book, My Glimpse of Eternity, became a bestseller and launched the writer on a career as an inspirational speaker. Duick journeyed south to check on the story and found that Maltz's doctors denied her account, calling it almost a complete fabrication. Nor was Christian Week willing to back away from the abuse of power or clerical misdeeds in Canadian conservative Christianity. They covered a number of scandalous sexual missteps by leaders in churches and parachurches, which inevitably called forth letters demanding the magazine not wash the faith's dirty linen in public. Their attention to the unpleasantness surrounding a shake-up among Pentecostals in Ontario and the move of Masters College Seminary to Toronto exposed an ugly brouhaha in the denomination in 2003. An article on the miserliness of churches when it came to paying speakers, entitled "By Their Honoraria Ye Shall Know Them," was considered such a touchy subject that it was published anonymously. It was a disheartening and all too accurate critique of the cult of thrift, written by academic and popular speaker John Stackhouse, which generated some positive feedback online and some change in behavior by Christian organizations, such that I will not be needing to walk among you passing the hat in a few moments. Christian Week was not one to court controversy. This is not an evangelical BuzzFeed or National Enquirer, but there were moments that caused its regular audience to make a sharp intake of breath. Two such instances were the decision to publish the depiction of a nude woman, which a Christian college had declined to feature in an art show, and an article entitled "Why I Help Addicts Shoot Up." Great was the foofara attending those stories. Now, all of this valuable work of defending the faith, uniting the faithful, critiquing the subculture, was conducted for 28 years on the tiniest of budgets, with self-sacrificing contributions by generous donors and creditors, by writers and editors such as Harold Jansen, Doug Coop, Deborah Feguth, Kelly Rempel, Robert White, Josiah Neufeld, Mag Story, by the production staff, and by countless stringers and columnists whose dreams of getting rich in the exciting new world of Christian publishing never came true. The energy and ingenuity of Fellowship for Print Witness in finding funding must be saluted. Every rabbit was pulled out of every hat, every marketing scheme was considered, many were tried, every possibility for fruitful cooperation or merger was discussed. Financial magic of the most dazzling sort, performed by Bram Ryan and Brian Koldick, saved the paper from near-death experience upon more than one occasion, but a short note in the September 2015 issue brought it to an end. Upon close review, deep discussion, and much prayer, it was agreed by common consent to cease printing Christian Week until further notice. The congenital disunity of Canadian evangelicalism, where denominational loyalty always trumped a more inclusive definition of Christianity, and the general flight from print brought that era to an almost inevitable end. But this is not an obituary. Fellowship for Print Witness still exists. Christian Week continues to maintain an online presence. Many nations have a sustaining myth of a not quite dead hero who will rise again when he is needed. The French have Charlemagne and the Germans Barbarossa, both slumbering in their mountain caves with their knights. The English have King Arthur, the once and future king, sleeping in Avalon. The Czechs have King Wenceslas, the Americans Elvis Presley. Canadian conservative Christianity, more than ever, needs a strong voice in the public square, and perhaps, like those sleeping heroes, Christian Week will rise again. There endeth the reading of the lesson.